Here we go. Yeah. So we are in this series and finishing up this series of this idea of what it means to live with a big mind, to have big mind help in a small-minded world, a small-minded reality. And that's the challenge, I think, for us in general, but even more so, I think, right now with the kind of dualistic stuff that's going on. I mean, we live in a polarized culture. There's no question about that, and it continues to seem like we can't get out of this polarized way of being, this divisive way of being. And our church is struggling with that too. Our larger church as a denomination is struggling with that as well over human sexuality and sexual rights. And so it's difficult to see past that. That's the story that I wrote about in the blog, one that I've told in here before. I just remind you in case you've forgotten it. The archer that went about looking for an archer that could match his skills. And everyone knew him to be the finest archer. And when he finally finds a village, he hears about an archer and goes and finds this barn outside the village where there are these bullseyes, these perfectly centered arrows. And he can look across the grass and the pasture there, and he can see that it's hundreds of feet away. These arrows are being shot from where this mark is. And so he marvels at it, goes into town, and they all tell him that he's not looking for a fine archer, he's looking for a total fool. And he says, no, he may be a fool, but he's an amazing archer. And then they tell him, they say, no, you don't understand. What he does is he shoots at the barn, and wherever he hits, he draws the circle around the target. And the story usually ends there. That's the joke, right? But it occurred to me, and I've told that story so many times, and it's one of my favorite stories to talk about, improvising a life and that sort of perspective. But it says a lot more about dualism and non-duality, about seeing things as either or, seeing things as perfect hits and sad misses, right? Perfect hits and sad mistakes. And it sees things in that regard as well. And there's something for us here. And I like to think that maybe the archer, instead of walking away frustrated, decided that maybe there was something to learn there. And so he goes and he lives with this fool for a while, until after a while the fool reminds him that no matter how he shoots his arrows, the winds are always going to be there. There's always going to be some kind of turbulence, something to shake things up just a little bit. And the real skill is learning how to paint circles. And maybe that's where I want to take us today. This idea of how we get past dualism. So examples of duality abound through the week. We had the Senate hearings, the confirmation hearings. And on both sides, you just couldn't get away from it. It's on both sides. And I don't even want to go to taking sides, but the question is always, when you look at agreement and disagreement, what else is there, right? Because there's something else substantive, something else beneath all of this that is not being dealt with. The either-ors, the right and wrongs, the black and whites are always symptoms of a deeper system, a deeper reality, a deeper dysfunction in the system. And that's the challenge, I think, for us to try to see in a non-dualistic way. That's what I think is this idea of the yeast that gets into something and changes how we see things. And we're dealing with it, I'm going to confess here, I have experienced a lot of duality this week, and the challenge for me has been to try to see beyond it. What else is here? When Linda and I were up in the north, up in Michigan, we went up to the north, up to Sault Ste. Marie, went across the bridge, Mackinac Island and all, went across the bridge up to Sault Ste. Marie, and on this side of Sault Ste. Marie, they had essentially the Canadian lumberjack events. Which was a tourist kind of thing. But, so we went and we watched them balance on the logs in the water and climb the poles and toss the log poles. But what it struck me as is when they got out there on the logs, a lot of them would fall off. And the challenge, of course, was to see the guys that could stay on the logs as they were moving along the water. But I realized watching that you don't learn how to balance on the logs. You have to fall. If you don't fall, you never learn how to balance. It's a constant balancing act. It's not either or. And that's the challenge for us, I think, all the time, is to see these situations as not either or. The vote coming up in February on what happens to our denomination, do we accept the language as it is in our discipline, or do we change the language? Do we get rid of the language that is exclusivist and limits rights for gays and lesbians? Do we become an inclusive community? And that is threatening to divide the denomination in some way or other. Not so much, I don't think, our church. Certainly not this community, perhaps, but definitely the Methodist Church as a whole is struggling. There's a lot up in the air. Midterm elections, February vote for the General Conference. I saw a movie this week. On Friday, I ran into Don and Tamara afterwards. And I have to admit, the movie Blaze, I don't want to give you too much of a spoiler alert with this movie, Blaze. I encourage you to see it. Maybe take some vitamin B12. Maybe drink an energy drink beforehand. It drags and it's a little depressing, but it's a fascinating movie nonetheless. And Blaze Foley, Brad, did you know Blaze Foley? Everybody knows Townes Van Zandt. Most people know Townes Van Zandt, but Townes Van Zandt and Blaze Foley were good buddies and singer-songwriters. And Blaze Foley's music was a major influence to numbers of big musicians we know to this day. Willie Nelson, Linda Ronstadt. A lot of these folks recorded his music. They covered his songs. But Blaze Foley lived out his short life basically playing in honky-tonks and sort of seedy bars, and then joined in with Townes Van Zandt. And his own story is a very tragic story of abuse and a difficulty of getting out of that narrative, the challenge of seeing something other than that narrative. All he could see is the missed target on the side of the barn. That's all he could see. And of course, he married a young woman, a Jewish woman, who tried to see that, no, there's a circle around that target, right? She tried to see this redemptive possibility, but he couldn't get there. And as many times as he'd get close, the old story continued to drive a wedge in his brain, and he couldn't get out of it. You had to sit through the whole movie, I think, to find something redemptive by the end of it. There was tons of opportunities to sort of see that, but if you see the movie, you'll see what I mean. But I will say this. Towards the end of the movie, he's sitting in the bed with his wife, and it's a retrospect back to their early days before they ended up getting divorced later. And she says to him, do you think we're born knowing how to love? And he said, I think so. Here's a guy growing up as a child in a terribly abusive family, and he says, I think so. And then he's got sort of a laid-back attitude. They're living at a shack up in the woods and kind of hippie lifestyle at this point early in the movie. And she says, then what happens? What happens to us? Why do we lose it? And he said, I guess just normal living. And then she says something really profound that even my wife didn't catch, because you do have to listen close to hear what they're saying. There's a lot of mumbling in this movie. And she says, I'm afraid I'm smart enough to know that I'm in Eden, but I'm not smart enough to stay. And that's a profound thing, I think, for us, is we forget that we're in Eden, and we get caught up in the conflict, and we forget how to try to invite others back to Eden. And it's a challenge. We are what we attend to. There's this wonderful story that I read when I was in seminary, because I studied this guy named Nikos Kazantzakis. Some of y'all know who Nikos Kazantzakis is. Nikos Kazantzakis was a Greek writer from the island of Crete. He wrote a number of books, but the most famous he would be known for is Zorba the Greek. It became a movie. He then wrote another book which was quite controversial, eventually became a film, which back in the 80s was extremely controversial. In the early 80s, it was called The Last Temptation of Christ. Some of you might remember being in protest movement outside. Maybe if you were part of the evangelical fundamentalists like I was as a young adult, then you might have been outside there protesting this movie because it portrayed a very human and a very fallible Jesus who struggled with his call, but at the same time lived out his call to the depth of his being, to the last of his life. But he was also married to Mary, ends up having a relationship with Mary. And So these writings that he wrote were trying to sort of stir things up. As Seth Godin would say, Seth Godin, the business guru, marketing guru, what Seth Godin would say is he realized, Nikos Kazantzakis realized that the only way you get people sometimes to look at things is to stir up the very thing that they're looking at, because they don't see it. What Vincent van Gogh would say in his artwork, that he said the reason why his artwork would make an impact, or he hoped would make an impact, he didn't realize it would be after his life that it did make an impact. But what he had done was, and if you look at it, you can see this, he had begun to experiment with what happens when you stir things up, right? What do you see when you stir things up? And look at his paintings. All of his paintings are stirred realities. And if you step back from it, you see something you didn't see before. But it's not easy to go there. It's not comfortable to go there. It's difficult, like we've often talked. It's much more easy to kind of stay where it's comfortable. It's easy to stay with the dualities. It's easy to stay where it's black and white, and you can get sides, going, and that's much easier. And partly it's easier because we don't realize that the story isn't complete. Partly we act out of that kind of duality because we think this is it, right? This is my story, the abusive story. This is my story, the defiant story. This is my story, the healer story. We think these are the final moments, and so we defend them unconsciously, and they become either ors again. How do we get past our own stories to see the stories of others? How do we get past our own stories to see the stories, to hear the stories of others? Anyway, Nikos Kazantzakis made this interesting comment. To make a living, he didn't make a living by writing these books. He made his living by writing travel books, traveling around the world and writing books about them. So he traveled to Manchester, England. This was back in the early 1920s, early 1900s, just after the Industrial Revolution. And he was looking out there at the... in fact, I think it was even 1906 or 8. But he was looking at the industrial factories in Manchester. And he was standing on a hillside outside of the town with a friend who was a Zen monk. And he said, "Isn't it amazing to see where humanity has come?" Well, he used the more patriarchal term, to see how far man has come. And look, he said, look at the industries, look at the factories, look at what man can do. And then the Zen monk looked at him and says, what man doesn't realize, he said, is that he has created a tulpa. He has created a tulpa. And Nikos didn't know what a tulpa was. Well, a tulpa is similar to a golem, if you're familiar with the Jewish term golem. It's also similar to a Frankenstein. It's this idea that the Zen monk who was trained enough could create himself, could create a replica of himself to serve, to do his bidding, to create and extend his will. The problem was that self is less controllable. That self also has the darker side as well as the lighter side. And once that is let loose, he said, you can't control it. If you create a tulpa, you essentially do something very unselfconsciously. You stop asking questions of whether or not you're doing the right thing. And you just continue to replicate whatever you are. And he said, man has created a tulpa. And what man doesn't realize is where that tulpa is going to go next. And of course, we know the Industrial Revolution has both its positive things, but also its horrible negative consequences that it created, and where we're dealing with pollution now in our world because of our industrial orientation. The interesting thing about a tulpa is that it represents a side of us we don't look at. At the end of the exhibit that I went to in Germany, I'm going to say this. I hesitated to say this, but I'm going to say this. At the end of the exhibit that I went into in Germany, there's an exhibit called The Golem, and it was in Berlin when I was visiting our son over there. And we went through this Golem exhibit, and it was fascinating because it showed historically the archetype, the image of golems throughout our culture, like Frankenstein, like the Forbidden Planet, if you saw that movie, like The Matrix, if you saw that movie, like Terminator, if you saw that movie. All of these things that end up backfiring, right? All of these backlashes that come back at you. And why do they come back at you? Why do we experience these backlashes? It's because we were never truly at a place where we looked at things honestly. We looked at things dualistically in terms of our egos, in terms of our own interests. And in that way, we failed to see the darker side. And the darker side comes up. And at the very end of this interesting exhibit this was back in 2015 when I saw this, or 2016 when I saw this. No, it's 2015 when I saw this exhibit. And I get to the very end of the exhibit, and at the very end of the exhibit, there's an article from Time magazine, and it says, America's New Golem. And it's a picture of Donald Trump. Now, before you jump on my back for getting political, I want to suggest to you, Baudrillard, the French philosopher, saw America as a tulpa-creating country a century ago. Because he said what America gets into is a materialistic orientation towards its reality, which is a dualistic thing. It's an addictive way of looking at life. And what happens when we do that is the darker side goes unchecked. Reality TV becomes what? Reality. And we no longer know the real from the unreal. We no longer know how to see truth or fact or fiction. And all that we see now are just opinions and sides because it's scary. So whatever you say, that's where we are today. But I don't think it's bad. I think that it's possible that we need to be where we are. I think it's possible that men need to be where we are, speaking for men. I can't speak for women. Linda reminds me not even to dare try to. But in a good way, she reminds me of that. And I went through feminist studies when I was in seminary. And when I was in college at UT, I went in social work. I went through feminist classes. And I sat with men in the outer circle as we learned how to listen to women's pain. And then 40, 50 years later, I'm sitting here listening to women's pain, wondering what the hell happened? How are we still here? And I realized that the reason why is because as men, we really haven't taken a close look at it. We really haven't struggled with it. We really haven't internalized the issues. And that requires something that is a little scary. But I think it's healing. I think it's potentially healing. And here's what I think we can do. I think we cannot see the wall of the barn as targets that keep getting missed. But we can see each of those targets that are dead center as moments where God's grace prevailed and we lost ourselves in a deeper passion of truth and relationship, and something good happens, right? And where something doesn't happen, we learn to step back and look at every one of those missed targets as opportunities to be more vulnerable, to be more attentive, and to listen to the stories beyond our own in attempts to redeem those moments. And I think that's where we are in our country today. I think that's where we are as a church today, a chance to see redemption as opposed to more division. My encouragement to you before the band plays, and I know they got up here, and they need to play here in a second, but and this is hard for me. This is actually quite hard for me to think through this. I've been struggling with this all week. Linda and I were sitting down and we were talking about something, and she reminded me of that camp experience that I had told you about a long time ago where the two camps that were occupying, the two groups of special needs kids were occupying the same facility, and there was a lot of tension between the two directors. One was a guy, one was a woman, but the tension wasn't necessarily male-female as much as it was something much more interpersonal between them. But the reality is it infiltrated the whole camp, right? It's that kind of stuff is insidious. It's like a seed. It gets in things, and it becomes the way we see things. How do we change the way we see things? And so what she did was she got a friend who was a Native American, a Cherokee, and an equestrian to bring one of her horses in, and the two camps stood around the horse and watched her do a naming ceremony. But here was where Linda reminded me of the power of horses to do this. Because as you know, horses are not carnivores, they're prey. They understand their relationship to the world as prey. So they have to be mistrust. They have to develop a place of trust, right? They have to learn how to do that. Otherwise, they're always moving because they're afraid of being attacked. So she brought the horse out here, and she would bring individuals up to this horse, and she would say, this horse needs you to be vulnerable, needs you to be honest. If you're going to be present with this horse, you have to be honest. You have to be vulnerable. You can't be pretentious. You can't be angry. This horse will pick up on everything. Horses are amazing radar for this kind of thing. She said, what I want you to do is I want you to touch its back leg, because as you touch the back leg, it will raise its leg for you to inspect its hoof. It knows to do that, but it won't do it unless it can trust you. And it was amazing to watch how many people that horse couldn't trust, and what it took for someone to finally walk up to that horse and to let go enough to experience that vulnerability, to allow someone to trust you. And that's where we have to get. We have to get to that place, being present with one another, where we can be vulnerable enough that we can trust one another. And when we get there, that's when I think we begin to learn how to paint circles around those moments.